It's very clear to me that FDR shut Eleanor down on internment. He does not shut her down on the refugee issue. Eleanor Roosevelt has a frank made. I mean, for those of you that are old enough to remember department charge cards where you just stuck them in a little vise and you put the ink roller on top to do an imprint. A frank is sort of like a dog tag, if you will, a military ID. Eleanor Roosevelt had a frank of her signature made and gave it to people who were trying to smuggle Jews out of Europe, and said that they had carte blanche permission to use her name and to put her name on any document. She called Breckinridge Long a fascist. That is not my word, that is hers. She worked with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of failure on different refugee crises. But for those of you who are in the mindset that bombing the tracks to Auschwitz would have helped, I certainly understand and appreciate that point of view, but I would like for you to look at the statistics for strategic bombing in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, in the current Iraq War, and in Afghanistan. We do not have drones. And so I have been on both sides of these issues. But if you believe that Roosevelt should have bombed the tracks to free people in Auschwitz, then you must also weigh on your own conscience the thousands who would have died to free other people.
One thing I can kind of give you a little what Roosevelt was getting from his top intelligence officer in terms of the Holocaust. And the short answer was not much. Donovan's OSS was getting what I would call shards of intelligence in from a number of different sources of some of the atrocities being committed in the various Jewish ghettos that were set up in Eastern Europe. And you look through the OSS records and you see information coming in bits and pieces. But Donovan really didn't make the Holocaust an intelligence priority, and you don't see much reporting or condensed reporting to Roosevelt over it, mainly because he knew his customer really wasn't all that interested in a big intelligence take on the Holocaust. Donovan's, to his credit, when the administration set up the War Refugee Board toward the end of the war to try and get more Jews out of Eastern Europe, Donovan's OSS officers served as paymasters for the war refugee operations, and he ordered his men to provide it all the support they could in the operational theater. He did it really because he hoped to glean intelligence from the folks that went out on the rescue missions that he could find useful for his own OSS. So there was somewhat of an ulterior motive there. Donovan also led the collection of evidence for the Nuremberg trials, the war prosecutions. He had some ulterior motives there too, not only to prosecute war criminals, but he wanted payback for the Nazis that had tortured and killed his agents. And he also wanted to make sure that his agents in the occupied areas that had worked secretly for the OSS didn't get swept up in the prosecutions themselves. On Japanese internment, just one final thing, Donovan advised against interning the Japanese, sent Roosevelt some very pointed memos on it, and Donovan's own staff thought it was a terrible idea. In fact, one of them wrote Donovan that we're going to make enemies of people that never were enemies. When it did happen, though, Donovan sent his own agents into the camps to try and glean intelligence out of Japanese Americans there and to recruit some of them for his own operation.
Speaking of advisors, of course, the critical figure in the whole issue of the Nazi attempt to exterminate the Jews in the Second World War was Henry Morgenthau, who hasn't come up today, but Morgenthau was a critical presidential advisor. And when you see this gap, when you read the McDonald diaries and you see the falling off of discussion about refugees, about the Jewish persecution in Europe, and it's interesting because in 41, when the Russians go in, and when the Germans go into Russia, and the Holocaust really begins, you do get at the end of that, at the end of 42, a major statement, but that's about it. Until Morgenthau comes along at the end of 43, and he's very upset with the lack of response, and it's his instigation and his conversations with Roosevelt at the end of 43, the beginning of 44, that results in the creation of the War Refugee Board.